Hello. All right, I'm going to call everyone to attention again. So I'm glad we've got great conversations going on. That's part of what this is for. I want you to talk to each other. But now we're going to start again. And before we get going with this next panel, I want to ask you another question. So if you weren't here at the beginning of the first panel, what I'm going to ask you to do again is pull out your phones, which I know are on silent, of course, but pull out your phones, and you're allowed to, in these one portions of the program, you're encouraged to use your phone. And as before, go on your browser to www.menti.com, menti.com. And if you put in the code before, you should be fine. But if you weren't here at the beginning of the first session, you're going to enter in the code 816758. 816758. All right. And you're going to see a question, and this is not a quiz question. This is your opinion question here. I'd like to ask you, you can give your honest answer. How would you feel if your son or daughter married a supporter of the opposite political party as yourself? So if you're a Democrat, how would you feel if you had a child who married a Republican? And if you're a Republican, how would you feel if you had a child that married a Democrat? Right? Would you be not at all upset? Would you be fine with it? Would you be somewhat upset? Or would you be very upset? Or very unhappy? All right, so we'll start. Here we go. Okay. You can enter your choice. All right, maybe you're torn. You have to think about it. All right. So we've got. Oh yeah. Okay. Here, what do we have here? We've got results. All right. 8% very upset. 58. A lot of people go into the middle category, which is a thing that happens in survey research. A lot of people cling into the middle category. We got about 55% here in the middle category as they come in, and 38% claiming they're not at all upset. Now, this is interesting because Gallup in 1960 asked a version of this question, and they found in 1960, 5% of the American public would be somewhat or very upset if they had a child who married the other party. Only 5% of people would be upset. But by 2010, in the public at large, about 30% of Democrats would be upset if they had a child who married the other party, and 48% of Republicans would be upset if they had a child who married the other party. So this is just one of the ways I want to get thinking about how the trends in the American nation and in public opinion specifically has been kind of tearing at the fabric of communities. And it's not just, this is the example, is partisanship, but it's not just partisanship, right? It's location, it's red state, blue state, it's urban, rural, it's race and ethnicity. These things have torn at us in different and new ways, and trying to understand that. Right? So our next panel is going to get at some of these issues and build on these ideas. The next panel is about the costs and consequences of distrust in specific American communities. And I'm going to start by introducing the moderator, and she's going to introduce our wonderful panel of experts. So I'm excited to introduce Jennifer Wallach, who's a professor of political science at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She's written extensively about trust in local and state government. She also broadly studies political psychology and public opinion, and some of her current projects concern emotions in politics, the roots of attitude ambivalence, and the effects of campaign intensity on learning and judgment. And here Jennifer will introduce our distinguished panel. Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and Thanks so much for having me out today to DC for this, Jim. We have a wonderful panel today. First up, we have Vincent Hutchings, who's a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's an expert in many, many things, including public opinion, elections, voting behavior, African-American politics. He has a 2003 book on public opinion and democratic accountability that was instrumental to me in writing my dissertation. I really enjoy it, encourage you to look toward it. Published extensively in a lot of top political science journals, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, very accomplished scholar and person in the discipline. Ron Fortier is publisher and editor of Crane's Detroit Business. He has a long career and distinguished career in journalism. He's served as a senior political columnist for the National Journal, longtime Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press, has a new book out that's really interesting sounding, a kind of a biographical journey with his son to go on a summer road trip to presidential libraries, which speaks to my geek heart very deeply. And last, but certainly not least, Liliana Mason. She's an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and in a very short time of being just an assistant professor, has really built a tremendous reputation as a national expert in questions of party polarization and social identity. She's published in the top journals in political science. She won the Emerging Scholar Award for APSA's Political Parties and Political Organizations section, and has a brand new book out from the University of Chicago Press about uncivil agreement and how politics became our identity. So I'm very pleased to have such a distinguished panel to talk to today about trust in government and the costs and consequences of trust in communities. As an opening question, I'd like each of our panelists to answer this one. Politics is all about competing values and conflict and disagreement, and there's so many dividing lines in politics, and we see those in trust in government as well, that it's clear that trust is not something that's uniform in the American public. There's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of differences. We don't all trust the same, and there's a lot of dividing lines in which some are more trusting than others, whether it's the haves versus the have-nots, or differences by race, or differences by class, or differences by status, differences between levels of government. And this is something that came up in our first panel too, and Shayla's talking about disaggregation. And I'd like each of our panelists to kind of maybe articulate what they see as the most important dividing line in terms of thinking about the differences between the trusting and the mistrusting. Where do you think is the biggest fault line between separating those who feel good about where the government is going and those who feel a lot of mistrust? So, Vincent?
Okay. Starts with a very hard question. Let me start out by saying I'm also happy to be here. I thank Jonathan and others involved, Josh, in setting this up. I'm happy to, contribute to this event. So what are the most sharpest kind of dividing lines in terms of trust in government? This was said on the earlier panel, I think, as well. Obviously, the partisan divide is at the heart of the political divide in this country with respect to trust and other things as well. But when you move beyond the partisan categories and look at other kind of social cleavages in society, also something that was focused on the previous panel would be issues of race and ethnicity, but also issues of religion as well, and indeed religion and religiosity. So not just your denomination, but also the extent to which one is devout or not. And issues of class are important as well. These are some of the biggest dividing lines in American society. And with respect to trust more broadly, as was pointed out previously, it depends on what is the target of that trust. Are we talking about government writ large? Are we talking about government as a symbolic entity? Are we talking about government at different levels in terms of state and local? So it depends a lot. So the question is a good one, in part because of its complexity. There are these different cleavages that I've identified, but the answer may differ depending upon the different level of government that one is focusing on.
I'm going to do something that I hate when politicians do this to me. When I ask a question, they answer the one they want to, not the one I asked.
Beautiful.
Because I think the questions, the answer is a little bit bigger than the question suggests. we live in a time of almost unprecedented change. Huge economic change that has all kinds of side effects, including income inequality. Huge technological change, a technological revolution unlike anything we've seen since the beginning of the industrial era, which has all kinds of side effects, including some of which make life simpler, but many in which make lives much more complicated. The iPad gives our children access to all of humanity's information, but every pervert in the world has access now to our kids. On top of those two big things, we have a huge demographic change in this country, as we talked about in the beginning, in the first panel, which comes with all kinds of complications and anxieties. And throw in a new kind of warfare, this mysterious, vague, non-ending war on terrorism. And we have a society, we have a people that is being forced to change dramatically. Think how much your life has changed in the last 5 or 10 years. And all of our institutions aren't adapting as quickly as we're being forced to change. So that creates all kinds of distrust. I think that's where the fundamental distrust is with all our institutions, and not just politics. And this is an odd thing for a political hack to say, but I think politics is way downriver from social change. We don't trust our churches. We don't trust small businesses, big businesses. We don't trust banks. We don't trust Little League. We don't trust our sports teams. We don't trust anything. And we especially don't trust politics. So what happens in times like this, politics on that part of the river, that downriver, we saw it happen at the beginning of the 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century. Another time of change like this, and we're seeing it happen now. Basically, the public, and this is pretty universal, basically asking, which side of the barricades are you on? Are you on the side of me, or are you on the side of those other guys? Now, it breaks down differently depending on what jersey you're wearing, what color you are, what your economic status is. But basically, we're asking, what side of the barricade are you on? And we're getting one kind of politician who cut it two different ways. Successful politicians in times like this, our era and the beginning of the 20th century, are populists. Now, you can do it in a positive way. Yes, we can, which is what Barack Obama did. Or it's the economy, stupid, which is what Bill Clinton did a few years earlier. Both those men, by the way, won the county that I now live near, Macomb County, with these change messages, I'm on your side of the barricade. Or you do it in a very negative way, which is what I think Donald Trump is doing. By the way, Donald Trump won Macomb County. Many of the same people who voted for Barack Obama voted for Donald Trump. So there is a deep and I think universal distrust in politics, because politics, like every other institution, hasn't adapted as quickly as we're being forced to adapt. Politics is still being operated the way it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It's not changing the way it needs to change. We're not changing the institutions of politics in the way that the public need them changed.
So I'd like to sort of tie together a few threads that came up in the first panel and sort of related to what Vince was saying earlier. That, one thing that we're seeing is that our parties are becoming more socially sorted. And so we have, our racial identities are dividing us by party. We're being divided by religion. And the thing about that is it's not just that it's creating these homogeneous parties, but it's also the extent to which any given person has the correct match of identities for their party is something that can predict how much they distrust the other side. And so there's a predictive quality about the amount of social diversity that you have within the party and the way each individual person feels like their groups match their party. That essentially creates a sense in any given partisan that the other party is so much different from them in every single way that they just can't, not only can they not be trusted, but they can't even really be understood as having normal human motivations. And so the more we have these identities all lining up along the partisan divide, the more we're seeing people kind of unable to even see across that divide anymore. And this is, it's somewhat asymmetric across the parties in that within the Republican Party, those identities tend to be white, male, Christian, conservative identities. And so there's sort of a double bind for Republicans in particular, because one thing is defending all of your identities in every single election. The second thing is feeling like you have a status in society that is being threatened. And so if you have this giant mega identity connected with your party, and you feel like every election is a chance for your status to be knocked down, then your investment in winning every election is so strong that the other team's victory is just a massive threat to your sense of who you are and your place in the world.
If we think back to how trust has been studied in the kind of early days of the first things written about trust in academia, it seems to me that there's a real focus on pointing the finger at government to say that it's about the scandals, it's about the management of the economy, it's about performance, it's about what government's delivering on. And I feel like that's not been part of our discussion so much as it's been going today. Instead, we're thinking about these dividing lines in trust in terms of being religious divides and racial divides and partisan divides and urban-rural divides. Like, to what degree is the current syndrome of mistrust that we're thinking about in society attributable to government? Is it that government is, as Ron suggests, maybe not being as quick to adapt to these social changes, or is some of this mistrust perhaps inevitable to just a changing society where we have entirely different social dividing lines than we had?
I think unless we see the kind of disruption in politics that we've seen in the retail industry and in the entertainment industry and every other institution, until we see real disruption, I mean, like blow it up and rebuild it, we're going to have continued distrust and dysfunction in politics. The reason we're accepting, and I think it's really sad that we're accepting almost as a fait accompli this negative partisanship, that we don't vote out of love anymore, we vote out of hate. Nobody really likes their party, but they hate the other one most. Until we get back to a time when we're voting for something, this country is in a world of hurt. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to trust government enough and politics enough until we really blow up the institutions. And I would include redistricting and money and ballot access and half a dozen others, until we modernize them for the 21st century in a way that was done in the first 20 years of the last century, another progressive era.
Again, a good question. And one thing I want to say in response to that question, but also in some of the tenor that came out in the first panel, is that some of the lack of trust that's directed at government or that's a consequence of our evaluations of government is due to behavior on the part of government. So we've talked a lot about government. We've talked about government at the federal level, the state level, the local level. But we haven't talked about one of the prime manifestations of government that many people interface with, and that would be the criminal justice system. And that's something in terms of police or the courts, the local courts, with respect to communities of color in particular, their interactions historically with this particular manifestation of government. And this has implications, by the way, and there's plenty of research on this by people like Veshla Weaver and Amy Lerman, among others, many others, demonstrates that when you have these negative interactions with manifestations of local government, police officers in particular, that this can have negative implications for your propensity to participate in the voting process. If the manifestation that you interact with has the ability to kill you with impunity, you might imagine that wouldn't foster a lot of trust in people. And as a consequence, that might discourage them from wanting to participate in these broader, what many of us in this room might regard as benign institutions, but they're not indeed perceived as such, and appropriately so, by many members of our broader national community.
And I would just add that there's, in line with that, there's also sort of a disingenuousness that was connected with party political messaging for the last few decades. Even the Southern strategy itself was based on essentially covering the real message with a different, more palatable message. And as long as a party's intention is to essentially either trick people into thinking that their policies are different than they really are, or implicitly try to get their support using resentments that they already hold, Either way that is, it's not a completely open and honest way of campaigning or messaging. And if we're seeing our parties not tell us the truth about what they actually want to legislate, or they're running on messages they don't actually plan on enacting in government, there's going to be a natural decline in our trust of their abilities to actually do what they say they're going to do.
That's how Trump gets elected.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
So each of you have kind of provided a different sort of role for government in this, in terms of what government should be doing to stop the problems it has. And I wonder if you could each articulate a little bit more about what you see as the one or two things the government could do to promote trust or, encourage a greater sense of trust. So maybe Lily, you want to start with talking about maybe what the parties could be doing differently?
So when we think about partisanship in general, there's a famous social psychologist, Marilyn Brewer, who said every single human being has two distinct needs, one for inclusion and one for exclusion. And one thing our parties are doing for us is making us feel included, right, in this group that's always in these competitions that are on TV, right? It's like watching a sports game. We get to watch the returns come in, every 2 years or more. Now we have all the special elections that we're watching, like on the news for hours. And so, we get to feel included in a group that also excludes a whole bunch of people who are going to feel awful if they lose, and we're going to feel great if we win. And every vote in Congress is portrayed as a win for one of the parties. Every bill and piece of legislation, the question is not, is this good for Americans, but instead, which party won this debate? It makes it very difficult for people to come to any kind of agreement, the legislators to come to agreements when the outcome of the bill is going to be either you won or you lost. Yep. And the parties right now are fostering that approach. It keeps people watching, it keeps people voting, it activates voters, it activates the base, people pay attention, so it works. But the more they do this, the more they're focusing on victory as the outcome rather than legislative sort of greater good for the nation. And governing comes second to victory when the most important thing is to provide your fans the thing that they're asking you for. So, to some extent, it's hard to say that they ever would stop doing this and treating it like a horse race. But that could help, right? If there was some sense of, at least in legislation, let's say, right? This is about policy that hurts or helps real human beings in the country. We're not going to throw balloons in the air when this bill is passed. These are real people who are being affected by this. So this is not where we're going to talk about horse races. Even just finding one space to say, please just stop making this a win or lose battle. This is for everyone, and everyone's affected by this. So they won't do it, but it would be helpful.
Here's how they would do it. No, in zero-sum game politics, politicians acting the way they are is a big problem. But here's how you attack it. I'll just do 3 reforms and 1 generational change. Reform number 1, blow up the duopoly. Ballot access is a big issue in this country, both for voters. We have one party that's trying to restrict a certain class of voters from voting. It's a huge problem, but even a bigger problem, or at least as big to me, is we have 2 parties who have written the rules in every state, so they have a monopoly on the ballot, a practical monopoly on the ballot. Why is it at a time when we walk around with 1,000 songs or 10,000 songs on our hip by 500 different artists, we only get to pick between 2 parties? And if a movement wants to have a different party or wants to force change, or at least threaten a 3rd party or a 4th party or 5th party or 6th party, we don't have the ability to do that because the duopoly, the 2 parties, have restricted access to the ballot. I'd start there. Redistricting reform. The organization I used to work for, National Journal, back in the 80s, did a survey of Congress and found 323 centrists. That is Republican members of Congress who were to the left of the most conservative Democrat and Democrats who were to the right of the most liberal Republicans. So 300 and some members of Congress in the middle. The last time the National Journal did that survey, there were 11. We have just a handful, literally a couple handfuls of districts that can be competitive every year. Maybe 3 or 4 dozen that are within 5 percentage points of the last general election. What happens in business if you have no competition? The product sucks. We have no competition in politics. We have a duopoly, and they're drawing the districts with technology. Gerrymandering has been around for a long time, but we've never had the ability to atomize people as much as the parties now do. So let's attack that fundamental institutional problem to politics. Lastly, money. I was not a big fan of Citizens United, but getting rid of Citizens United isn't the panacea because The system sucked before that initiative, right? So let's look at something different. I don't have the answer, but I think if you talk to younger Americans, they would be in favor of something like, look, I don't have a problem if my senator is bought by tobacco, but I just want to know it. I want to know where the money is. So why don't we now have the technology, why don't we open source politics? As soon as you cash a check from anybody, it goes up on the website. It goes up on the site so we can immediately tell who it is that's being bought by whom. In my state of Michigan right now, our legislature has slush funds that we'll never be able to find. You know this, right? The legislature is a system where they have all this dirty money that we can't find. If I can see it, I can vote. Not only will I be able to vote more authoritatively, but they're less likely to take that kind of money if they know it's going to be seen. So there's many reforms like that. That's just 3. The big generational one, folks my age, get the hell out of the way. Us boomers and Gen Xers, get the hell out of the way and let this great generation coming up, the millennial generation, and I think Gen Z, what we're seeing in Florida, these 2 generations that are shaped by the times that I was talking about earlier, they have the makings to be, they are bootstrappers. They are disruptors. I would love to see what they do with government and politics and all these institutions if we get the hell out of the way. They're already doing some amazing things in social and political entrepreneurship. What if we let them bring shit to scale? That's what I would like to see. We got to get out of the way. We've already had our shot and we've blown it.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. So I think the comments that have been made previously on this panel, I'm in total agreement with. I think that, and I like Lily's earlier point about focusing on the ways in which elites have framed political discourse in terms of the zero-sum, semi kind of sports-like discussion is problematic. But I think and so I endorse that point of view completely. But I want to push it even further by saying that some of the problem is embedded really in people like those of us in this room. So we've talked a lot about the ways in which various elites have helped to foster some of this mistrust, which we're all kind of experiencing or seeing evidence of. But we've been maybe a little too quick to point the finger in the direction of the Republican Party, and I haven't seen a lot of pointing in the direction of the Democratic Party, as if the Democratic Party isn't also guilty of many of these same transgressions. So let me just, right. I'm not sure if that's the case, actually. I think that, so we often talk about the way in which the Republican Party fosters division and goes after unpopular minority groups. But in its own way, the Democratic Party, and I don't mean the Democratic Party in the time of segregation, I mean the Democratic Party in the modern political era, does much the same thing. I mean, Bill Clinton ran on a platform of ending welfare as we know it. I'm not talking about George Bush, I'm talking about Bill Clinton. And he governed in that fashion as well. I mean, the crime bill that he pushed in the 90s, and not just Bill Clinton, but even the sainted Barack Obama. We can criticize him as well. The Father's Day speech he gave in 2008, where he went out of his way to be critical of the parenting of African Americans and to highlight and to make salient all the stereotypes that have historically been visited upon that population. He engaged in that kind of behavior in a systematic way and consistently. And the Democratic Party, to put it more succinctly, the Republican parties have tried to link the stereotypes associated with minorities, immigrants, African Americans, et cetera. They've tried to link those stereotypes with the Democratic Party for generations in order to gain electoral advantage. But the Democrats have not done nothing in response. They have tried to run away from those same populations for the same length of time, in part by saying, yes, those populations are guilty of those things, and that's why we're going to be a new Democrat. We're going to be new Democrats. That's what Al Gore and Bill Clinton said at the time. Or adopting various policies of others who have followed since those, from Michael Dukakis to John Kerry to, yes, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So I mention all that to say what? To say that we, those of us who follow politics, who are interested in politics, as we level our criticisms against the people who are on the other side of the aisle, let's level those same criticisms when there are transgressions that are comparable, even with the politicians with whom we identify with.
Can I give you a little anecdote to back that up? In '92, when Bill Clinton was running for president, I was covering him in Arkansas as a State House reporter. I was in the chamber when Ricky Ray Rector, an African-American man who had lobotomized himself, shot himself in the head after he shot a cop. I was in the chamber as for 20 minutes they're trying to find a vein, and I could hear this man groaning in pain as they kept sticking his needle in his vein. President Clinton oversaw that, Governor Clinton oversaw that execution because it was a smart thing to do politically.
We have to sense sometimes that trust is something virtuous that we should be cultivating, but is that wrong? Is mistrust something good, appropriate, something we can do as a tool against a system that we're cynical about?
Well, that's a great question. I'll just say quickly as a reporter, I think skepticism is important to have. So I think as a citizen, skepticism is important to have. As a reporter, cynicism is a flaw, gives you blind spots. I think cynicism as a culture is bad. And right now we have a very, very cynical, sick culture because of our lack of trust.
I mean, so the problem with the way that we think as human beings is that so much of our political thought is based in motivated reasoning, and we find the information that we want to be true, and we find it as much information as we can find to make it true in our minds. And when we see information that we don't want to be true, we counter-argue it as passionately as we possibly can. We bring to bear as many arguments against that piece of information as we can. And so in a sense, as long as we have enough information from a partisan source, we construct our own political reality to some degree psychologically. And so the mistrust itself, or cynicism, or just sort of cautious thinking about government, in its pure distilled form, I think is healthy and useful. I think the problem with just the way that people think, the way that we are, is that we don't do that. We don't apply mistrust evenly, and in particular, we tend to slather it on the places where we don't want that thing to be happening, and or we don't want to be told that we're wrong, or we don't want to be told that we're not behaving in a moral way, and so the mistrust that we tend to use, if it were applied evenly, it would be helpful. But the fact that we apply it subjectively is essentially weaponizing our mistrust itself, right? It's taking it and turning it against the institutions that we should be looking at even-handedly. So as long as we're not applying it in an equal way, I think it's going to be problematic. But then so is trust, right? It's a double-edged sword. Trust is also not applied equally.
Yeah, I think I think one of the interesting things that's come up earlier here at the conference is that trust can be something that we direct at different levels of government and even different entities within a particular level of government. So I guess the short answer to your question is that it depends. Some particular entities within government and under some circumstances and in some historical periods, some levels of government have in fact been deserving of considerable trust, and we should lament the fact that if and when that trust is not extended on the part of the citizenry with respect to those entities. But by the same token, sometimes particular levels of government and entities within government are not deserving of trust. Certainly the Flint, if you think about Flint, Michigan, I'm coming from the University of Michigan, and we're all familiar, I imagine, in this room with the ways in which the local government, facilitated by the state government in Michigan, helped to poison the people in Flint with respect to the lead that's in their drinking water. I don't think the relevant entities in that case should be extended a lot of trust. And it's probably a good thing that the people don't trust them. Indeed, the fact that they did trust them at the outset, to some degree, may have helped contribute to the disaster that unfolded in that city.
Now, to your point on weaponizing trust and it being slathered on one side, how many Democrats in this room know that it is a fact that the EPA, Barack Obama's EPA, knew about the poison in Flint, had a whistleblower in Region 8 of the EPA, and shut down that whistleblower? that the Democratic administration also, along with the Snyder administration, knew what was going on and shut it down. Probably very few people know about it, but it's a fact. Because we don't, if you're a Democrat, you don't want to acknowledge that. You want to blame Snyder, and he deserves it. You want to blame the local government, they deserve it. But the federal government had some culpability too. And how do we right-size poorly functioning government, let alone trust, if we're not willing to look at our own house as critically and as skeptically as we do the other house, to your point earlier.
And to even just add to that what we know about motivated reasoning is that the people who are the best at it are the people who know the most about politics.
Right. And in Michigan, the head of the healthcare administration is likely going to face trial. And Snyder, his political capital was sucked away within a couple months, deservedly so. The head of the EPA for the region was able to retire for full benefits, and nobody even knows what she did. Very few people know what she did. The people of Flint know what she did. People of Flint still don't have water that they can drink.
For me, when I think about government, I feel conflicted too. Like Beth was commenting in the first panel, we have these mixed feelings. As a group of politically interested, politically active, politically attached people, I think we want the best from our politicians. We want them to be amazing, storybook, kind of like straight out of the social studies textbook kind of politicians. And we aspire that for them. And that's why we like the idea of having a trusting society where everyone's kind of like, we're living the dream of what American politics could be. And at the same time, we're observers who follow all this stuff, and we see all the ways in which politics falls short and all the ways that we have reasons to be mistrustful, reasons to be cynical. And so the title of this panel is one that's about, the costs of trust. And I was trying to figure out, how should we conceptualize the costs of trust? I mean, is it something where we're glad that we have a cynical public that's going to hold politicians' feet to the fire? Or is it an undesirable thing where we have a system where our mistrust is tied to this kind of negativity about politicians failing to live up to what we learned that they should do in social studies? And I was wondering kind of what you guys envision as being the costs of trust.
Well,
mistrust.
I think the previous panel made a series of good points about the corrosive effect of kind of rampant mistrust. And I'm certainly, my comments previously notwithstanding, I'm not encouraging cynicism per se, but I am encouraging skepticism. Yep. And I think a healthy, as was stated by Ron, a healthy amount of skepticism is appropriate so that we, as a population, governed by the various people we presumably elect into office, that we can hold them accountable when they hold them accountable doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation. When they do things that are appropriate and that are laudable, then we should be showering them with appropriate rewards. But when they don't, we should be behaving in the opposite fashion. So, maybe I'll just end on that point.
Look, again, I agree with everything you're saying, and this is much bigger than politics. Again, politics is at the far end of the river of social change and social trends. What's happening here is an existential threat to our way of life. The only thing that separates anarchy from civilization are institutions that we trust in. So skepticism is healthy. But we're beyond. We're a decade, 2 decades beyond skepticism. The trust in every institution, except for the military, as you all know, has dropped 20, 30, 40 percentage points since the 60s, and it's really hastened when change really began, going back to my theory, at the beginning of the aughts. When that happens, when we have lost fundamental faith in our institutions, we move closer to what is a society without institutions, which is anarchy, which is tribes, which is tribalization, which is no common set of facts, no North Star, no common belief in what our society and our country is going to be, no referees, no shame. There used to be a time when somebody who stepped out as a priest or as a head of the Boy Scouts, or as the head of the Republican Party, or as the head of a bank, if they did something that was bad, we had a common shame police. We all said, that is wrong, you must go. Now, as soon as that happens, we divide, and it's not just Republican, Democrat, we divide into our camps. Because when we don't trust our institutions, skepticism is healthy. We always will be skeptical. We're human beings. But when we don't trust that our banks and our small businesses and our big businesses and our organized religion and the Boy Scouts and our sporting teams and our family, which is the first social institution, when we don't trust our institutions, we don't have a society. And we certainly don't have a healthy democracy. And right now, I think our democracy is existentially sick. And if we don't get our act together, if we don't fix these institutions, if we don't completely reform them in a way that the generations come up, trust them, skeptical, but trust them, we're screwed.
Yeah, and I would add that also the.
Can you say screw to Georgetown?
Just did.
Okay. Twice.
I would also add that being skeptical of our leaders and our government, is I think a time-honored American tradition, and it's something that we've done forever. And we've seen politicians hurl terrible insults at one another since the founding. I think something that's really going on now that I find worrisome, and I think is it's sort of bleeding out of this elite distrust that has become so pervasive and so polarized, is that it's the distrust that we hold for our elected officials and our partisan opponents in government. We're starting to apply it to our partisan opponents in our towns and our neighborhoods, and so I have some research where I've asked people if they'd be willing to live next door to a Democrat or a Republican, if they'd be willing to be friends, if they'd be willing to, I asked the marriage question, if they'd be willing to be acquaintances. And in all of these realms, people don't want to be close to people from the other party. This is regular. We're not talking about a mayor who we have to vote for next time. We're talking about your next door neighbor. And so I think that's a real cost, and it's not going to stop with not wanting to live next door to somebody. And in fact, I just collected some new data with Nathan Kalmo at LSU looking at dehumanization of the other party and acceptance of political violence. And it's relatively low. Levels of acceptance for political violence are relatively low. But the dehumanization of the other party, it would be better if large portions of the other party just died. 20% of Americans agree with that statement. It's enough that it's not a majority, right? But it's enough that it's quite worrisome. And as long as we see this polarization of trust, that's only going to get worse, and it trickles down to individual, human relationships that have nothing to do with politics.
We the people has become we the people just like me. That's not a country. It's a bunch of tribes.
Does government have an obligation to try to de-tribify America in that dimension, to try to make us all agree? I mean, have we created incentives for them to want us to bring us together in that way?
We've created incentives for them not to lead, gerrymandering and money and all the things we're talking about. I think it's, again, I'll say we the people again, I think it's a bottom-up issue. We have to decide that we're going to change the structures of government and politics and all of our institutions. We still do have the power to change things in a big way. We don't have to sit back and wait for some white knight to come on a horse, which is what Barack Obama was for a lot of people in 2008, and which is what Donald Trump was for a lot of people in 2012. We have to stop waiting for that magic leader and fix these big problems ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the idea that someone's going to descend from the mountaintop and solve these problems for us is obviously a fantasy, but I think it's a question of just there are short-term incentives which run counter to the premise of your question or the thing that you're asking for. In the short term, it's in the interest oftentimes of politicians to want to foster divisiveness, particularly if it's in their electoral advantage. But I do think that there are long-term considerations and long-term incentives that run in the opposite direction. And so somehow we've got to find institutional ways to foster those medium and long-term incentives. And we're never going to demolish the short-term incentives, but we've got to find a way to at least make this more of a fair competition, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways that we got here was that we used to have these cross-cutting identities, and now we've got these sorted identities. And there's a very valid argument to be had about whether or not it was better when we had cross-cutting identities, because at that point, I think it's the first panel was saying, we sort of didn't have a tolerant party on either side. So it's not necessarily better to have it that way. It certainly makes for less partisan conflict when you have cross-cutting identities. In the end, I actually think that the parties themselves can't do all that much based on the way that they have strategized, campaigns and elections at this point. Ultimately, it's probably going to just be demographic changes that they won't affect the elections for another couple decades, but ultimately there will be we'll have a new demographic makeup, and the party coalitions that work right now are not going to work in 20 years or 25 years. And so in some ways that will create new cross-cutting alliances, in which case there may be some reduction in polarization that way.
If you were paying attention a couple of years ago, you could see this coming with Donald Trump. If you're paying attention now, you can see some of this change already, some of the positive change already beginning. In your home state, Michigan, the state you and I live, there's this young woman, less than 25 years old, who's had it up to here with the partisanship of the parties and the idea that there's no competition. So she's radically connected with a bunch of people, like-minded people like herself, and she's about to put redistricting reform on the ballot in Michigan. There's not a leader in Michigan who knows her name. And she may be the most powerful person in Michigan right now. And you see this happening all over the country, especially that generation taking matters in their own hands, seeing a vacuum, and filling it. They're not waiting for a sainted night to come down. They're certainly not expecting either party to fix it. And they're not just doing it in politics, by the way. They're doing it in business. They're doing it in arts and culture. The social entrepreneurship that's out there, to me, is the only silver lining to this morass that we're talking about.
The last time we had party polarization like this, we have to travel back, 100 years, 120 years or so. And it was a time of social change. It was a time where information was exploding in a new way. Everyone was accessing information. There's a lot of parallels between kind of late 1800s, early 1900s politics and the politics we're seeing today in terms of social changes in information. And we met that with populism in the kind of 1900s era. Do you think that is something we should expect here? And is populism something that is rooted in trust or mistrust?
It's rooted in skepticism, and it's rooted in an overwhelming desire not to put up with the status quo. And again, it's bottoms up. So the progressive era started with the muckrakers, started with journalists who realized that if they stick a finger in the eye of the three white men who controlled everything, the monopolists. By the way, one of them was a woman who didn't have the right to vote yet, Ida Tarbell, one of my heroes. You could have tens of thousands of people for the first time reading one publication, and you can put an advertisement next to that and create a business model that's now dying. It was the people who gave rise to people like Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, the progressive era. It wasn't Teddy Roosevelt didn't create himself. So now you go back to that era. Somebody said this in the first panel. It was a moderator. We weren't predestined to come out of a period of change like this. You said it in the 1900s. You couldn't, if you were walking around in Michigan in 1905, you thought the world was coming apart. Yeah, there was great technology. Ford had this assembly line going on, but you're talking about income inequality, and you talk about immigrants being held down in Detroit, and you talk about, matter of fact, new technology making life simpler and more complicated. The automobile was killing people at a huge rate, and people were dying to go back to the horse and buggy days. I mean, literally, the automobile was seen as a threat in 1910. So, and politics was a complete and utter. Everything was so corrupted, even more so than now. You couldn't predict, you couldn't be sure that we would come out of it, but we did. And I look back at that period and I think to myself, wow, who was the Donald Trump type figure of that day? So we know who galvanized populism in a positive way. But I look again at Michigan, Father Coughlin, a Catholic priest in Royal Oak, Michigan, who used the technology of the radio to demonize Roosevelt, and he was a bigot trying to divide people. You look at Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana at the time, using the new technology. What if Father Coughlin had Twitter? What if Huey Long had Facebook? So that's what worries me about this time, is we can so quickly change things positively, but we can also quickly change things negatively. So yes, I think we're in an era like that. Yes, I think we have the ability, more so than ever, as evidenced by that one woman I cited in Michigan, to make things better. But man, we got to do it really quickly, because the forces of negativism have that same power to turn us, to spiral us down quicker than we can imagine.
I guess if I could jump in here quickly, I'm kind of two minds with respect to the question. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's definitely the case, this has already been articulated here on this panel and on the previous panel, I believe, that the way in which elites, be they in the media, the mass media, or in government, or in the political parties, the ways in which they frame issues is absolutely consequential. It has, we know from reams of social science research over the past several decades that it can influence how we think about issues, what issues we think about. So I don't dispute that for a moment. But so the other hand for me would be that populism, I get that there's been a lot of discussion regarding populism, but and I think Mark said this on the previous panel, politicians have been highlighting a number of different things in order to put together a winning coalition in whatever election they're running in. And sometimes populism is part of that. But I'm not sure how much populism is driving the extent to which those politicians tend to be successful. Because the evidence that I'm familiar with suggests that it's actually not. So I don't dispute that politicians are talking, at least at times, in ways that we might characterize as populist, but I'm not sure if the mass public is responding to that particular message or to less benign pronouncements that are emerging from politicians.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of go back to historical references, right? And it's like, yes, there were populists that were doing well, but also the know-nothings were doing well, right? And so, which one are we actually seeing in our society right now? The idea of a pure populism that is, looking out for the interests of economically disadvantaged people across the board. I'm not sure that we've ever had a real, full, just 100% populist, just race-blind populist movement, and the idea that it's so connected with immigration attitudes, that there is, this. If there is a sense of economic threat, it's very connected to who is doing the threatening, and the sense is not that the people who are doing the threatening are, big banks and corporations who are, handing out mortgages and ruining the economy. The people who are doing the threatening are, brown people, and that's not just populism, right? That's something that often masquerades as populism, but it's much more, I think, dangerous and damaging. But it's also much more powerful, because the best way to get somebody riled up is to tell them that something unfair has been done to them, and then B, to point to somebody they can attack for it, who's weaker than they are. And there's almost no better way to get somebody out of their chair than to say, that guy over there just stole everything that you wanted. It's like a magical formula.
If I could just make something clear, because I'm academically outmatched here. When I use the word populism, to me there's a positive side and a negative side of what I consider populism. To me, populism, the way I've always used it, is in a time of great change like this, politicians say, what side of the barricade? Voters want to know what side of the barricade are you on. To me, Barack Obama, in a positive way, was a populist. I'm with you, and yes, we can fix this. To me, Donald Trump is on the negative side. I'm with you, and we're all against the rest of them. But to me, it's when I talk about populism, that's how I'm defining it, which is probably wrong.
Well, let's open the floor to questions. So you first.
Hi, I'm Abigail Woodward. Hi, I'm Abigail Woodward. The biggest group that seems to be under attack is women. The unprecedented number of controls that are being instituted against women's reproductive rights and our economic power, and I mean, that's across the board. I understand race, I understand class. Y'all, it's gender. The future is feminism, and the white guys are freaking out.
It's interesting you said white guys.
I'll just respond to that quickly. The gender gap is increasing significantly. There is, there's no reason that we have to pick that we have to pick one, right? It's all intersectional.
That's right.
The idea that you're right. The idea that white employed married men are Christian are feeling under attack is absolutely a large part of this, but they're under attack from many directions. And in fact, it's kind of the entire edifice upon which they have always stood at the top of the social hierarchy is crumbling. And so, to some degree, we have to deal with the idea of the identities of men who are feeling that their status is being threatened. They're going to respond just like anybody else whose status is being threatened, except that we know that when you are on top of a social hierarchy and your status is threatened, you tend to respond with more violence than if you're lower on the social hierarchy and your status is threatened. So it's something that we can easily foresee and predict and explain. How to deal with it, I'm not sure is as clear.
Just very quickly, I agree with what Lily has said, and so it's not about pitting particular groups and the misery that they may be experiencing against each other, and I don't suggest that that's what you were indicating as well. We're very mindful of the gender consequences of contemporary politics, and if I can speak for the panel, I think we all find it, distasteful. But we.
Other factors.
Fair enough, but the point I was going to make is that most white women voted for Donald Trump. So yes, gender is important. Yes, the gender gap has been growing, and yes, we should be mindful of the ways in which women are oppressed and the range of different ways in which this plays out. But we should have no illusions that white women are somehow not contributing to voting on behalf of the current administration.
And at the risk of over-fixating on and having too much hope in the millennial and Generation Z, I will say that if you're a 25-year-old male, you don't sit at the top of the hierarchy. You're part of a generation that's the most diverse in our nation's history, and partly because of that, also extremely tolerant. If you're a 5-year-old American white male, you're a minority in your generation, and you're not on the top of the hierarchy. These two generations are going to look at things much differently, and these fights in this debate we're having in here, they're going to look at it and say, what the hell were you guys doing? And hopefully by then they've got it turned around.
I respectfully disagree.
Please do.
I do agree with Lily that demography is going to have, the changing demographics of the country are going to have implications for our current electoral politics. There's no doubt about that. But the notion that if we just hang on long enough and the new generation is going to solve our problems, that's a bastardization of what you said, but it's a version of what you said, which is that
I'm not saying let's hang on.
Well, whether we hang on or not, the notion that the upcoming, I am aware of no evidence that suggests that the millennial generation is somehow free of the biases that we've been talking about today relative to older current generations. Whatever virtues the millennial generation has, they are not free of our vices.
They're not free of them, but they do have, they are less tied to them. They are statistically more purpose-driven. They are statistically more bootstrapping, more likely to take on big challenges and not be hidebound by the way things have done before. They are statistically data-driven. There's data to back this up. They're much more consensus building. They like to work together to get things done.
But they're not statistically more tolerant.
They are statistically more tolerant.
Not when it comes to supporting policies designed to address inequity. That is simply not the case.
Define that for me.
The millennial generation is not more liberal when it comes to policies that are designed to address inequities, particularly in the domain of race. I've looked at this question, I've published on this matter, and I can tell you right now, it just ain't true.
Now, the millennial generation is much less likely to be involved in politics, correct?
Well, younger people in general are not involved in politics.
Is this generation more or less likely to be involved in politics than generations at their age?
That actually I'm not sure about.
But you don't think the millennial generation is more tolerant?
They are more tolerant when it comes to individual kind of interaction sorts of things. So
that's what I'm talking
so
about.
on matters like, say, interracial dating or marriage, they look vastly different. But
Gay marriage.
Yeah, gay marriage, things of that sort. But when it comes to policies
Okay.
that are designed to address, so it's the difference between individual level discrimination or individual level prejudice and racism and structural
So
and
why do you-
institutional.
that's interesting.
The
So why do you think
millennial,
that is?
millennial,
So
because
if I could just try
No,
to
I love
like
it.
try
No,
to
I'm not,
tie
I'm
this
not
together.
debating now. I'm curious why that
If
is.
we could just tie this together, it's I mean, really what we're seeing is a generation that is much more demographically diverse than the people that came before them. And so in that sense, they're more exposed to people who are unlike them. So we have more contact between lots of different types of people. But they're still being bathed in the social structure that we have right now. And they're growing up in the structure in which white men are still at the top of the social hierarchy, even if they're no longer numerically the biggest group within their generation. They're still, in terms of social power and prestige, they're still at the top in the world they're growing up in right now.
And you think policy-wise they're clinging to that, is your
Yeah.
point? Again, I'm academically outmatched.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a
never thought I'd do this.
graduate student at the School of Foreign Service. And I think there is qualitative and quantitative evidence that says that in every community where there's distrust in the problem-solving capacity of institutions, democratic institutions, populists tend to do best. And I think Donald Trump is a very good evidence of that. And one of the reasons why he is still supported by such a large group is because he's basically disrupting those institutions every single day. And my question is how to fix it. Like, is this trust in the problem-solving capacity of Congress, of the democratic institutions, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, is it justified? And what's the answer to it? Is a massive redistribution efforts like we've seen in the 40s and 50s, is that the answer to it? Or what do you think? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Just to clarify, so you're saying the policies associated with populism.
No, I'm saying that, so I think that there is evidence that whereas distrust in the problem-solving capacity of democratic institutions. So I'm saying that whenever there's distrust in the problem-solving capacity of democratic institutions, populists tend to do best. And I'm saying that some of this distrust is justified by income inequality. And then I'm asking you, what do you think are the policies that might address this distrust, whether it is massive redistribution or education efforts? I don't know. That's what I'm asking.
Well, I mentioned the three. I mentioned three earlier. I'd go to the fundamentals of politics. Three would be gerrymandering, money, and ballot access. Where does the root of the problems that's making us not have competition in politics, and how are we as people incenting our leaders to divide us and to not compromise? And let's turn those structures on their head.
The policy, I think the difficulty of that question is that in order to address this distrust with policy solutions requires government to function, because policies don't happen unless government's working. So it's sort of a catch-22, where unless the government is functioning and trusting of each other, we're not going to get any policies. And so they can't fix the trust problem because they don't have, there can't be, I think, a policy-based outcome to this the way it is right now. It's sort of in a stuck position.
Although that's how, again, I'll say that's how it looked in 1905, 1910. And we made it so senators had to be elected by us, and
Right, yep.
kids couldn't work 40 hours a week.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the solutions that Ron has suggested there are some feasible things that can be done, like addressing gerrymandering and various other things. Lily's right to point to the intractable nature of this problem, and it's a difficult one, right? I mean, I guess we're on a panel that's designed to talk about the implications of trust or mistrust, and by implication to also talk about some potential solutions. If we had the solutions, we would be in a better position, I guess, than we'd be doing something about it. I mean, that is a very tough nut to crack. I think identifying the problem is a first step to getting at the solution and coming to grips with what is the source of the whatever problem we're focusing on. And I think academics and others who are similarly motivated can be good at doing that. And that's not a trivial thing to accomplish. But then getting beyond that to the next step, okay, now having done that, what's the appropriate solution? We can give you some broad outlines, but it's going to take a lot more work.
It does start with us. I mean, how many people who voted for Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders have really tried to figure out why somebody voted for Donald Trump? And how many people who voted for Donald Trump have really tried to figure out why somebody loved and supported Hillary Clinton? We have to get out of our, as you guys have been describing, our political boxes and I'll be willing to look at each other as Americans and not a red shirt who I don't want to live next door to me.
This gentleman said his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Name is Dave Onsbach, retired. I know about 100 years ago in California, Hiram Johnson came up with initiative and referendum for the state to counteract, the big money legislature that being bought by all the financial supporters and what have you. And now I forgot the name of the decision that allowed that going on to federal level. That allowed contributions, big money contributions to the federal level you were talking about earlier. Is it possible, considering some sort of a national initiative and referendum, to help make government policy so we don't have to go through congresspersons who get money from, who cater to those who give financial support to them, and so people can help make laws directly at the federal level with some sort of national initiative and referendum and recall of both elected and appointed federal officials through popular vote? Is that something that has been discussed and be considered to address skepticism about government? Thank you.
Any reform like that is easier done on the state level than amending the Constitution. But I'll just say, I'll get back to Hiram, what was his last name? Johnson? Governor Johnson, who, by the way, then Roosevelt was the one who signed that legislation. I think you're talking about making it so corporations could not donate. Governor Johnson didn't do that. As a matter of fact, and Teddy Roosevelt didn't copy it and make it a federal law. The people did. He got elected. A bunch of people decided, the Californians decided this is what they wanted. He saw political cover in it. That kind of big reform comes from the bottom up. And that's what's got to happen here. Now, tactically, you got to be smart about which ones you take and how you message it and who your coalition is and whether you do it in the state or whether you do it in the federal government. But socially, politically, yes, it can be done again, but it's not going to be done by a governor or a president. It's going to be done by us.
And also, we should be careful about, wanting too much direct democracy.
That's true.
The consequences of that would be that we don't have, we wouldn't have had a civil rights movement. So, often the leaving questions to every legislative question to the vote of individual citizens tends not to go in the direction of fairness often.
So one of the things that I've wondered about is how deep this goes, and in the context of the conference where we're trying to come up with measures of consequences, in a sense, like, what are the outcomes of this? One of the ones that I've had on my mind, and I wondered what you all thought, is, are we actually rooting for the country anymore when the other side is in power? So I'm a big sports fan. I hate the Yankees. I think there's every reason to hate the Yankees. I mean, I don't exactly root for their plane to crash or anything like that, but I do root for them to lose and for bad things to happen. And that's fine in baseball. But, I get this sense, that when a good jobs report comes out from the Trump administration, there's this, sadness among my Democratic friends, But, of course, that's jobs for ordinary people who we ought to be, caring about. And I wonder if we've reached that point, and what I'd love for you guys to talk about, if maybe we have, maybe we haven't, but how would you measure that? Because let's face it, nobody really wants to say, well, I'm rooting against the country. We'd have to, find some way to, in a sense, trick them into it. But I wondered what your thinking is. How deep has the dislike and the desire to have the other side exposed as a bunch of charlatans, how deep has that run?
So I think there's two different ways to think about it. One is actually wishing harm upon the country, which I think a lot of people won't even admit that they're doing, right? To themselves, maybe. One way that I might measure it is actually just thinking about whether or not they believe the good news, right? Because most people, at least in my experience, I find that people hear good jobs news, right? Democrats hear good jobs news. And it's not just that they feel sad, but they also feel like this isn't real, right? This is not happening. And these numbers aren't going to last, and everything is going to be ruined, and just you see, right? Wait and see. It's all going to go downhill. And this is all, this sort of temporary, any good news is a temporary thing. And so it's almost like we argue it away rather than wish for it not to be true, perhaps. In which case, you can I would imagine just asking people, do you believe that these jobs numbers mean good things for the American economy? You're going to see a different, by the party who holds the White House, you're going to see polarized answers every single time the party switches.
Yeah. If you had done if you were able to quantify social media posts, and if you've been asking the question the last 6 months of Barack Obama's term, if every month you would ask, what do you think of the jobs numbers that come out every month? If you're asking Republicans and Democrats that, or if now you went back and looked at the same pool of people, their responses to the job numbers then and the job numbers now, which by the way, they're pretty similar. I know anecdotally, I see it all the time on social media that people who are now, Republicans who are now praising the numbers, were calling the same set of numbers that Obama had that are pretty similar. Not good enough, now they're saying they're great and we're coming back, and vice versa. So the jobs numbers almost gives you a control.
That's different from what I'm getting at, though. What I'm getting at is, if you're a Democrat, do you want them to be bad? And I think the answer to that is actually yes. You dislike the other side so bad. You want Derek Jeter to retire. You want CC Sabathia to blow out his rotator cuff. I mean, horrible things like that, and that's fine. Again, if you're talking about
you want the plane to crash.
Team.
In politics, they do. They want the plane to crash.
And so how do we get at that? I mean, because I think that's the most pernicious change that's happened in this environment.
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's what's been discussed previously is related, certainly the disbelief in good news, or attributing the good news either to random events or to some preferred actor, the previous administration or an administration that belongs to your party. But you're getting at something even more pointed. Like, would you even want, hypothetically, for the out party relative to your partisan affiliations to do well on X, Y, and Z dimension? And to be honest, I don't think I've seen that question or any variant of that question before.
What if he asked a question something like, if the only way that Donald Trump could leave office between 4 years is that Dow Jones would drop 10,000 points, would you be okay with Dow Jones dropping? Maybe ask it like that? I bet you a lot of Democrats would say yes.
I think that it's even worse than that. I think that they think to themselves, I don't care how much money is going to be in my 401k. I'd rather or other people, what their jobs are going to be. I just want him out.
So maybe frame some hypotheticals like that.
I don't know. But I think it's reached that point.
Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier talking about collecting this data on wishing harm upon political opponents.
No doubt about it.
A surprising number of people are willing to admit that they wish harm upon their political opponents. And then we ask them at the end, did you just say this because it felt good to say, or did you say it because you sincerely believe it? And the people who said that they sincerely believed it, those were the only ones I was reporting numbers on, right? The 20%, those were only the people who said they sincerely believed what they had said. So there's a real sentiment out there that...
Is that, I'm assuming that's risen? Do we have tracking numbers?
It was the first time we've measured it.
20%, wow. So the real number is probably twice that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Colin Fallon, and one of the things I've been thinking about during this conversation is this notion of competence of government. So, for instance, we've been talking a lot about the parties and the politics, but in terms of actual sort of the day-to-day stuff that the different agencies do, for instance, and just this conversation that just came up in terms of like, you think about Katrina, right? And that was Bush's failure. That wasn't a failure necessarily of FEMA, although it was talked about that, as well. But it was definitely, I think, associated with a partisan. There was a partisan skew on that. You think about Puerto Rico now, right, with the response there. That is a Trump failure, but it's also a government competence failure in a way, right? So I guess part of my question is there a way? Is it such now that these big events, more than just the day-to-day stuff, but the big events where government becomes visible beyond just criminal justice stuff, or but, the response, what have you, is there a way to make that non-partisan? So, for instance, I'm thinking, I don't know, and the moonshot predates me, but was that a Democratic victory or Republican victory, or was that an American technological victory, for instance? If we had some sort of moonshot today, would that be clearly associated with the Democrats who were in power, or the Republicans in power? I mean, is there a way to, separate the overall competence or incompetence, the performance of government agencies from the party that's in charge at the time, or are we beyond that now?
That's a good question, but a difficult proposition. I mean, when you think about Katrina, it wasn't viewed as a government failure. It was viewed as a Republican Bush administration failure, fairly or unfairly. And but I think your comparison point is actually a pretty good one. Now, the moonshot, I was around for, but I wasn't all that attentive to politics at the time. But my sense is that it was seen as a victory or a triumph for America. And it was the Nixon administration, but it wasn't seen as this is a Nixon triumph or a Republican triumph. It was an American triumph. It's hard to envision that in the 21st century, a comparable kind of event, in part for all the reasons that people have been talking about on this panel and the previous panel, the negative partisanship. So my point very succinctly is that it's not so much about the nature of the event. It's about the manner by which the event is interpreted and the partisan lens to, harken back to the American Voter, the prominent publication from 1960 that highlighted the importance of partisanship. The partisan lens by which we are evaluating and assessing these different outcomes is the obstacle that you're kind of grappling with here. It's not so much about the nature of the event, from where I'm sitting at least.
Yeah, now we're able to, on our own, because there's 300 million editors and publishers now, and now we come to the conclusion that Katrina was just Bush's problem. We forget that there was a Democratic governor who was pretty incompetent herself. I mentioned Flint earlier. The malfeasance of the Snyder administration is close to criminal, if not criminal, but we forget that there was Democratic EPA. That's because we're all looking at this through our partisan zero-sum game lens. It wasn't that long ago when we had stronger institutions and gatekeepers, and we'll never go back there, and I'm not saying we should, but when you could have someone like Walter Cronkite say, the Vietnam War is lost. And we all went, man, Vietnam War is lost. Some people who were still supporting the Vietnam War got really upset because they didn't think their voice was heard because Cronkite had just declared it over. But we had a common set of facts. We had a referee. We had a North Star. We had institutions that were strong and that we trusted. It wasn't perfect because they were all led by middle-aged white guys. But now that we all are, now that there aren't gatekeepers, and now that we all are micro institutions, 300 million, not just editors and publishers, but now there's 300 million mini institutions. I don't know we can't go back to the old ways. We shouldn't. But how do we now come to, as a people, what are the new institutions that we create where we can all decide that is wrong and that shouldn't happen again, that person should be shamed. Let's as a country, hold this individual, this institution accountable. As a country, let's fix this institution. I don't know what replaces the old model, but it's got to be replaced.
Well, I think it's really important to keep in mind also the moonshot was an American victory because we were racing Russia. And all of the intergroup conflict, theory and literature has shown over and over again that one really good way to get two groups that are in conflict back together is to give them a common enemy or a superordinate goal that they're both working towards, and without any conflict or competition for resources between them.
But that lasted for 6 months after 9/11.
Right, but because partly because Iraq turned, yeah, but you know, the idea right now that we could have, we have Russia, right? Russia attacked us, and it's not working. So,
Better example, yeah.
you know, maybe if aliens invaded the Earth, then we could. All right. You can always hope. You can always hope.
We'll take our last question now.
Hi, thank you. I'm Lorelei Kelly from the Beck Center here at Georgetown. Just to have some silver lining here, a couple points. One is that I'm thinking it's harder to be more dystopian than me, and I feel like going out lying in the middle of the street. I work with a lot of millennials, 35 and unders, and the bigger problem for them is that they, I think, have assumed that they can either engineer institutions out of existence or engineer around them. They're finding that's absolutely not true, and they're trying to also figure out new ways to connect. I think that's a huge positive impulse and appetite for institutional values that we're not picking up on. On the Flint, Michigan water crisis, remember that problem was exposed and somewhat brought to the fore by a crack team of technologists from Virginia Tech, who was kind of a libertarian in his political sentiments.
Dr. Edwards.
And a bunch of, yeah.
And a young doctor,
yes.
first generation
Yeah, no,
Iraqi
I get
doctor.
it, yeah, exactly.
And a housewife.
And a bunch of homemakers. I talked to both of the committee staff on the Democratic and the Republican side while that was happening, and they were really interested in figuring out how to also decentralize the democratic process to include those voices in the hearings in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. So there is real impulse toward this, decentralizing the institutions, taking the functions where people care about them. And just a final point, like, I don't know, I'd like to ask this room, how many people here have both an urban and a rural background? I mean, we're scatter plots of red and blue. I'm not purple. I moved from Berkeley Hills to Farmington, New Mexico when I was 12 years old. I grew up with people who I'm sure thought I was going straight to hell, but they were going to pack me a really good lunch for the trip. And I wonder why we don't hear more of those stories. Like, I still know I can go home and talk to a lot of people who completely disagree with me, but I'm definitely not purple. My lefty friends think I'm really right-wing on a lot of issues, and my conservative friends think I'm a flaky lefty on a lot of issues. So there's some of us that are doing something right, that have true empathy for both of these ways of life. And I just never see that talked about or highlighted or polled or tested. But I would argue that, I mean, every single state in this country has urban and rural districts in it. The Senate is more important than the House in that way. Those are the ways to reorganize democratic practice. Those are the ways to organize new competitive political constituencies around time and space that I think you really gotta start looking at, because they are the bridge across this dysfunction.
So if I can just jump at the second one on Flint, is a great example of the kind of new thinking we need to bring to government. So you're right, that's how it was brought forward by a researcher in Virginia, a doctor in a hospital in Flint, young second-generation Iraqi, and a housewife. And both parties, the political structure blew it. The fundamental issue I have when I really look at it is, you know, what was happening was government kept testing the water. And red flags would be raised, and then government would get together, and they'd test it some more. And then they want to make sure before they went to the public that they tested it again. And EPA was doing it, and the local agency was doing it, and Lansing was doing it. And then when they realized they had a problem, then they had to have a bunch of meetings to decide whether we're going to announce it and how we're going to announce it. Focus groups, polling, all this stuff internally trying to figure out how to manage the situation. And I got to thinking, why in the hell were they doing this without me knowing about it? Why are they doing water tests on my behalf that I don't see? Why the hell aren't water tests, and that, for that matter, why isn't every government food and safety test open sourced? If those three people were able to find that after 6 months of poisoning kids through the back door and with whistleblowers, how quickly would they have found it out if every test was open sourced? If every time there was a government or a private water test, if it was put up on a common website that we all could look at it, and people like Dr. Edwards could have seen the patterns months prior. The reason is because government's still built like it was for the last century, very paternalistic. We have all the answers. We don't want to panic you. We don't want you to see these scores until we know that there's a problem. It needs to be more open source. The government needs to be more run by us and for us, and that's a very small example. Why isn't every health test that is done on our behalf, why aren't those tests, even if they're false positives, let me see them. Let us decide. Let us open source them. We would have fixed Flint a lot sooner.
We do actually measure the diversity of people's political, social networks. We ask people in the American National Election Studies, we ask them, how many people do you talk about politics with? And we kind of have this series of questions. So we can track it over time longitudinally. And people's networks are getting more politically homogeneous. I think one of the problems is that our system is really built for a largely rural nation, and today 20% of Americans are rural, and 80% of Americans are urban or suburban, right? So we keep trying to make sure that we get real America, the heart of America. There's only 20% of America is actually in those places. So I do think that there is this sort of generational change happening. I asked undergraduates whether or not they believe that America's best days are behind us, and like all the MAGA questions, right? Like America's not, the future of America's going down the drain. And all of the students that I asked this question were super nostalgic for the good old days of America, and they were nostalgic for Obama. That's who they missed. So they were all MAGA, right? They were like, make America great again, bring back Barack Obama. So we have a completely different set of, we have a different social makeup, we have a different set of people, we have a different way of interacting with each other. Right now we're moving in the direction of being really isolated culturally and politically from each other. But under no circumstances do I think that it's inevitably going to keep getting worse. We're changing as a nation, and I think what we're going through right now is the labor pains of that change. And if we survive it, I think we'll get to a new place. We just have to get through it.
Can I just tell a quick story about when I realized Trump was going to win this thing?
Please do.
To your point. So she's from Frankenmuth, Michigan. This is my map of Michigan, which is right about here. You live in Ann Arbor, I live in Detroit now. My wife has a cottage up here in Michigan, right in the middle of the Huron National Forest, and it's Trump country, it's militia country. And I'm sitting in a bar in Glenny, Michigan, one of these dives in northern Michigan, with a guy who I've known for years, a decent guy, smart guy, well-informed guy. And I said, who are you voting for? And of course, he's going to vote for Trump. Why the hell are you going to vote for Trump? He says, well, he's pissing off you guys. He's pissing off those Democrats, and they left me 30 years ago. He's pissing off the Republicans. They've been lying to me the last cycle. And he's pissing off you reporters, and I can't trust you guys. I said, yeah, but if you walked into this bar right now, how long do you think it would last? Oh, about 10 minutes. We'd kick his ass. He's such a punk. I said, what's going on? He says, you know what we need, Ron? We need a controlled burn. He said, you know what a controlled burn is? A controlled burn in northern Michigan is when you purposely set fire to the forest to get rid of all the underbrush, all the deadwood, so that you have a clean, healthy forest so it doesn't set on fire on its own. He says, we need a controlled burn in America. And I go, yeah, but, and he finishes my sentence. He says, yeah, I know, he could burn the whole thing down. But we need a controlled burn. And that's how people like that are thinking. He knew that Trump wasn't his kind of guy, but he just wanted to send a message to Washington. Trump can't be worse than what we have now. You may not agree with it, but we got to understand it.
Well, perfect end to the panel, perhaps. I'd like to thank everyone. Please thank our panel.